Ali, hi, how are you, man?
Good. How are you?
I'm great. I'm so happy. I'm so excited to be doing this with you today, man.
I'm glad we could make it work. I'm sorry we had to reschedule, but
No. And I'll talk a little bit about, why we had to reschedule
yeah,
and kind of how it took all of us by surprise.
yeah, no kidding.
Yeah, man. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you. I'm glad to be home. It's
Yeah.
been a while. I was on the road for, I don't know, 10 days or something, and anchoring shows and reporting and all of that. It's, this kind of experience that I have overseas, not here in America.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think we're all kind of worried about your health. We heard about the rubber bullets being shot
Yeah.
around and you getting tear gassed and all of that. And
Thank you for your
listen,
concern. All seems to be well, though.
good,
A
good.
little bit of a bruise, a souvenir from it, but that's it. That's it.
Yeah. No. We're glad that you're okay. And all right. So without further ado, I want to introduce a man who needs absolutely no introduction. He is the host of the weekend news show on MSNBC, has his own show, Velshi, Ali Velshi. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
My
So
pleasure.
glad to have you.
Good to be with you.
Yes. So we want to start off kind of going a little bit hard into Black Lives Matter, especially within the context of the South Asian community. We are inherently within our own dynamic, we're doing a lot of unpacking. We came into this country not really understanding the historical dynamic, not understanding civil rights movements, and that, the politics, which is tied to the economics of the country, is inherently based in racism. And there's a lot of unpacking to do from that standpoint. And, within the greater context of post 9/11, a lot of us not having citizenship, not having voting rights.
Yeah.
Within that context, how do we start unpacking a lot of the damage that has already been done by the complicity? We've been so complicit over so many years. How do we begin this process?
Well, I think there are a couple of ways to think about this. One, and it's often related to an immigrant experience, right? There's sometimes a sense that if you come in and you work hard, even if you come in with nothing, you can make that work. And generally speaking, we subscribe to the American ethos of meritocracy, right? If you do well, you will succeed. And I think that's generally true in most circumstances. What we have to get our heads around is that that's just not been true for African Americans for some structural and historical reasons. And if we think of slavery as something that ended in 1865 and Jim Crow laws that ended and the civil rights movement of the late 60s, we think, all right, maybe it was in the late 1800s, maybe in the 1900s, maybe toward the end of the 1900s, but at this point, everybody's got the vote and everything's equal. And what we haven't thought about is, unlike South Africa, where apartheid ended and society was upended, that didn't happen in America. The end of slavery, the end of Jim Crow, the civil rights movement were significant but incremental movements. And there's still this underpinning of inequality for African Americans that none of us will experience the same way. We may experience anti-Muslim bias. We may experience bias because of color of our skin. It's all true, but it's different from the structural reasons why African Americans suffer it. And they suffer it in economics, they suffer it in healthcare, they suffer it in justice, they suffer it in economics, but they really suffer it at the hands of police. And there is a structural reason why a police officer in America apprehending an African American man is going to be a bad thing. Part of that is the history of policing. Part of that is the statistics that the police officer has in their brain about what threat this poses. Part of it is the strain on the black man or black woman, and that's different from our experience. And we have to just get with that. We have to get comfortable with the idea that it may not be our experience. It might be, but it probably isn't. But that makes it no less real, because unless they are free, we're not more free. These things are intertwined. And I think since 9/11, we've learned this on a lot of levels, including the fact that, for instance, the work that's been done between Muslims and Jews, right? In understanding that hate amongst one group is hate amongst the other. It's rare to find an anti-Semite who's also not an Islamophobe, or vice versa. So we've learned some sense of, I don't have to be like them and have their experience to understand what their issue is. But I think we do have to work harder for African Americans to understand their experience is unique, it's different, it's important, and you got to pick a side in history. This is the moment where some people are going to be asked to pick a side.
Absolutely. And I think when we look at the entirety of Black Lives Matter, the entirety of the movement, we have to start thinking in algorithms. We have to start discerning these things and say, okay, well, if Black Lives Matter does not succeed as a movement, then no lives matter, right?
Correct.
It is the civil underpinnings of our society. And so for us to say, okay, well, we need to pick certain parts of this because if, we say blue lives matter or all lives matter, that negates the entire movement of Black Lives Matter.
Yes. Gets you into a cultural war on the wrong side. So I think people have to remember Black Lives Matter doesn't say Black lives only matter or
Right.
Black lives are the only ones that matter. It means that that Black lives are not taken as seriously in this country in economics, in justice, in social policy, and in policing as other lives. White lives matter, all lives matter, police lives matter, but police, all white, we're not subject to the same things that Black lives are subject to. That's the thing you have to remember. Black lives matter because society doesn't actually believe they matter, so we have to deal with that. That's the full sentence we have to remember. White lives are not they're not systematically under threat. Blue lives are not systematically under threat. There are people who harm police and they shouldn't do that, but it's not systematic. The system is not built so that police get killed. The system is not built so that white people get killed. The system is not built so that all people get killed. But we have a system that increases the statistic chances of you being killed because of a police interaction because you are African American. And by the way, the statistics also indicate that by being African American, you get poorer healthcare, you'll get poorer housing, you won't live as long, you'll get diabetes, and you'll get heart disease. That's systemic. So Black Lives Matter is a systemic criticism. It's not a minimization of other lives mattering. We should have big enough brains to say all lives do matter, but Black lives are under unique pressure. And if we don't get with that movement, if we are not all free, then none of us are free. And that is something that I think our communities have historically been on the right side of, but it is important to now stake out a position.
Absolutely. And it all begins with education, understanding and unpacking
Yes.
our own biases. So let's get into a little bit of the economics behind this, right? Because, as we said, this is a lot of it is access to capital, right? It's getting through this redlining system of banking, right? And, I think the way that our communities, South Asians and other communities of color have gotten out of this systemic oppression have been access to funding, have been access to capital. And when we look at having convenience stores, for example, in these marginalized communities and the anger of the community itself, because they cannot have a business that's represented of their own people, of their own color, because they don't have access to these resources. This is probably where everything begins, because when you don't have access to funding, you don't have access to nutrition, you don't have access to good, proper healthcare, you don't have access to proper education, your property taxes are lower, you just cannot fund your own community. So how do we start rethinking this and how do we get out of this?
And if you don't have access to capital, you do not create wealth for future generations. So one of the things you've seen amongst African Americans, so slavery ended 1865, right? Everybody was a slave in a southern. Most people were slaves in southern states until 1865. Then 1865 comes along, and nobody's a slave. But the point of being a slave is that you were owned by someone, and your work, you were not paid for your work. So in 1866, you weren't owned by someone, but guess what? From 1866 until the 1930s, if you worked on a farm like you did as a slave, somehow you came to the end of that year and the owner would do the books, they do the reckoning, and mysteriously, everybody ended up owing their owners or owing the owners of the property money after a year of labor, because they take off for your coffee, they take off for your clothes, they take off for your lodging, and things like that. And somehow nobody had any money. So it wasn't until the 30s and the 40s, when the migration to the north began, that people started to get jobs in factories, in the industrial Midwest, in the Rust Belt, in places that we live in. So they didn't even start building wealth in most cases. African Americans did not start building wealth until the 60s and 70s. And then other things happened to affect that. But then they couldn't get mortgages in many cases. There was redlining. There was a study that's done by the Brookings Institution that indicates that you take the median Black house, right? The one that's in the middle of all value. Half of all houses cost more, half cost less. And you lift it up and you parachute it into a white area. The value of that property goes up 22%. So think about that. This has not been a community that's been able to pass on wealth. And one of the ways you create wealth, you either your job and you save money, you invest it in the stock market and money increases, or you have a business. And to have a business, you need capital to start that business. African Americans can't get loans. In many cases, they can't get loans for properties in their own areas. So we can talk about police brutality, and that's real, and police racism, but you can't solve one piece of this puzzle. You have to solve all of them. You have to look at this holistically and say, African Americans don't get health care at the rate that everybody else does. They don't get access to capital at the rate that everyone else does. Their wages are lower. Their life expectancy is lower. And 2/3 of Americans polled thinks that they don't get fair treatment at the hands of police. So you can't just take one piece of this. And the protests that I've been in Minneapolis and Chicago and New York, people are getting that this is a big thing. And by the way, the protests, I haven't been to a single protest that's been majority black. There are white people out there. There are white kids. And here's something to remember. A lot of kids at these protests. Somebody brought this to my attention this morning. If you were a teenager or a kid when Barack Obama was president, you're now in your 20s. You started from a place that you saw a black president. You thought that these things are okay, that maybe we're living in a post-racial society. So to those people, it's not that we haven't advanced, it's that we've moved backwards. So that's what people are out there saying, fix the whole system to be fair. And the problem is, if you are the beneficiary, as we are, of a system that is unfair to somebody else, then you're not free. You can't enjoy that. That's not really the fruits of your labor. If I'm going out and I'm getting positive treatment from the police that somebody isn't, that's not fair. So I have to lean into fixing this thing, and leaning in hurts. Because if you're a regular person, you got a business, you got a job, you got kids, you got parents who are ill, you've got coronavirus, you have real pressures on your life, and you don't want to lean in for somebody else's problem. But this is about civil rights. This is a moment in history. This is who we are as a people. That's not their protest out there. That's our protest out there. That is America's protest out there. And if you call yourself an American, wherever you're from and whatever color and shape and gender you are, if you call yourself American, this is your movement, and you have to lean in. And as I say to people, you know you're doing it right when it hurts. Right. It has to hurt a little bit. Maybe that means it has to hurt financially, or it has to hurt in terms of the effort, or it has to hurt in terms of the amount of walking you do in those marches. Whatever you do, everybody's got a different way of fixing this thing, but do something to fix it.
Right. And you look at the solidarity movement. This is what solidarity looks like. And we talk about this, and I want to kind of get back into just talking through this from an algorithmic standpoint. When we look at the finances behind this, it's not going to make complete financial sense to support the movement in the short term. But we are 1 degree away from this turning on us, whoever that community might be. Right? It could be poor, it could be white, it could be black, it could be brown, South Asian. It doesn't matter where you're from. Right. You're literally 1 degree, one news cycle away from this completely happening to you. And we have to redesign what our democracy looks like moving forward. And so when we come out of this in the next few weeks, as Black Lives Matter, as the movement starts dying down in terms of its presence in the news, as we start moving on mentally and we start focusing on other crazy things that Trump is probably going to do in the White House, and all these other things, how do we start refiltering this and saying, I'm not going to take the carrot. I'm going to actually work on this. And from a really, the longevity of this is extremely important.
So I think there's 2 things. One is Hassan Minhaj did a great thing the other day. I think you probably saw it, in which he reminds us, brown people, that we came to these countries on the backs of movements that made it fair for us to come. Absolutely. If you live here and you think it's fair, thank the civil rights movement. Thank Martin Luther King. Thank all those people who came before you and made it fair, because there was a time in this country where none of us would have been considered equal. Number 2, social justice has to be woven into your fabric. Now, I totally get that may not be the case. I get that there are lots of people out there who are not racists. But now we have to be anti-racists. Now we have to weave it into your fabric in the way that my kids have it woven into them. They're what I call woke. All right, much less than I am. I'm a liberal. I was in college. I was thrown out of protest. My parents are anti-apartheid activists, so I think I'm pretty much at the front of the line, but according to my kids, I'm not even close. But it's woven into their fabric.
Right.
Right? They know the language, they know the lexicon, they know what just looks like and what unjust looks like, and then they have a toolbox for it. They have a toolbox, whether it's social media or marches or protests or donating to organizations. They have a toolbox by which they can fix injustice. When you get complacent in life, you lose your toolbox. It's at the back of the garage somewhere. We all have it. We're born with a toolbox to fight injustice, but we don't know where it is right now. So everybody just needs to go find their toolbox, whatever it is that you use to fight injustice, because we all know what injustice is. It could be putting a Black Lives Matter sign on your porch. It could mean walking. It could mean marching. It could mean donating. It could mean discussions with your family about racism. It could mean discussions in your community, whatever. I don't know what it means.
Yeah.
Maybe you're a police officer. Maybe that means something. Maybe you're a lawyer and you give pro bono time. Maybe you're a journalist and you decide you are going to give space to conversations that you didn't think were things you were going to talk about. I'm a financial journalist. I'm an economics guy. Civil rights marches are not my specialty. But this time demands something of all of us. And I say that you are being invited into this discussion. Don't ignore the invitation. Every single one of us equally is being invited into a discussion about social justice and what the future of this country looks like and what this country that our children will inhabit looks like. Don't ignore the invitation.
Absolutely. And sometimes we have to go back out and buy tools for the toolbox.
Yeah.
Our toolboxes are all insufficient right now. And it's so important for us to make this a mindful act where we're educating ourselves before we go into action. We don't want to run into action too early. We have to understand the context, which we never paid attention to throughout our entire lives. Our communities never did. So now it's like this education process for all of our communities to get on the same page, to say, how do we reconcile faith? Where God, right, creates all man equally, that creates nature in a position where we must serve nature and nature serves us. Yet we have climate change on one end, we have social injustices on the other. In a previous show, we talked about the definition of war and genocide. And this has been a systemic war and genocide on Black people. And we are complicit. We are a part of this problem, and we're not doing anything about it. And I think it's really important to address that at its level, at the core, which is genocide. And
I talk about it. I talked about it on my show, and I got a lot of pushback from people where I said, you do have to do something about this. And a lot of people hear that and they say, I'm not the problem. I didn't do this. So why do I have to do anything about it? And that's just a mindset we have to change. And some of it will come. There are such great books out there. One that I always talk about is by Isabel Wilkerson. It's called The Warmth of Other Suns. And it's just a great story about post-slavery African Americans and the struggles through which they went. It runs from the 30s to the late 90s after the crack epidemic. I just think we have to understand context. And the beauty of 2020 is all you need is a phone, right? The context is all available to you. You can study it. You can Google it. You can find it. But we do have to learn the context. And don't beat yourself up if you don't know it. Don't beat yourself up if you didn't realize the context of it. That's what these protests are for. That's what this movement is for, to create awareness and to create discourse and to create a discussion around what it is. But we can't be binary about this. It's kind of like the Me Too movement, right? If you're not a rapist, doesn't mean that you're a hero to women. There's a lot of space between those two things. And we learned that, you have to be active about this. There's an unfair society in which women get held back. And you may not think you're doing anything actively about it, but you're subscribing to a society that does that. Well, we're also subscribing to a society that holds Black people down and holds them back. And there is a sense of social justice that you arrive at that says, until social justice exists everywhere, it exists nowhere. It's very much like the climate issue. And by the way, very similar to the climate issue, just because you don't see it doesn't mean it's not happening. That's what this is. African Americans, I have a guest on my show, he's a Princeton professor. He's getting hate mail. I had somebody else on my show who's a superintendent of the Palm Beach County school superintendent. He's part of the school district there. He gets threats. So it doesn't matter how smart you are and meritocracy and how good you are, if there is a threat to your life on a daily basis. And if we believe that's appropriate in America, then it is our job to step up and fight that. Because if we enjoy the fruits of living in this country and the meritocracy and the prosperity that it has given us, then we have to give back.
Right. And let's try to make this shift through Black Lives Matter into the financial world. This is something that Dr. Martin Luther King had alluded to, which is a lot of people are saying we need to pull ourselves up by the bootstraps. And after slavery was abolished in the United States, a lot of land was given to people that were migrating here from other countries, right? Yeah, our people from Europe and things.
Right.
Black people were not given anything. They were not even able to hold livestock on their
Right.
property.
Right.
And so you look at this systemic oppression of a very specific group of people, and then in the 13th Amendment, slavery might be abolished unless you're a prisoner of the state. And
Right.
so
Yeah.
now you look at this movement, and it goes into this greater financial underpinning that we've all benefited from. We've been able to come in, create that sustainable ability to receive credit, and then leverage that to create wealth for future generations.
Yeah.
How are you looking at financial models today, and what needs discernment at a global scale? How do we process that?
So there are several things here. And you're right in saying that they're inseparable, right? You can fix some things in policing, but fundamentally there are circumstances that occur that cause police to come into interaction with young Black people in a way that is not good. And some of that is a concentration of crime in certain areas. Some of that is unemployment. Some of that is underemployment and unfairness in employment. So we have to think about this on a lot of levels. We do have to think about the idea that African Americans are disproportionately employed at the lower end of the wage scale. We have to think about the fact that unemployment before the pandemic was at historic lows, but despite the fact that we've had a Civil Rights Act since the 60s, we've never bridged the gap. We've never actually closed the gap between white unemployment and Black unemployment. Black unemployment, although it was historically low before the pandemic, is disproportionate. There's always a gap, right? It's always higher than African Americans. How is that after all these years of the civil rights movement? So you can't look at prosperity without education and training. You can't look at prosperity without, as you said, the ability to raise capital both for housing and for businesses. So there sort of needs to be a general fairness. When I talk to people who are involved in the civil rights movement, and you're right to bring up Martin Luther King, because at the speech before he was assassinated, he was going to be talking, it was really a poor people's campaign. He was talking about economic prosperity and the degree to which white people experience those problems at the low end the same as Black people do. So we have to think about civil rights, poverty, minimum wage, these kinds of things are all connected. This is one of those situations that if you lift that tide of poverty, of healthcare, of access to education, of access to capital, you do lift most boats. There are some things that have to be dealt with specifically with respect to the African American community, including access to college, where we've got historically Black colleges and universities, but how to fund them and how to give people scholarships and bursaries to them. But fundamentally, the complaints of marginalized people in America are very similar, right? Poor white people don't necessarily know that their complaints are similar, but they are. There's an added component to being African American, but if we deal with the concept of the struggle to be prosperous for those at the lower end of the scale, service workers, people who have not been able to stay home because of coronavirus, because they've got to get out there and work, people who don't even want to get a test for it because they can't find out they have coronavirus because then they'll have to stay home from work, people who don't have health insurance coverage so that if they get sick, they can't stay home from work. That's the kind of thing you have to start fixing. Then you end up with communities that don't have higher levels of illness than other communities. They don't live in greater poverty. Then you have a level playing field and you can say, all right, there's a little bit of inequality here and here. We can fix that with legislation, but it's so unequal that we've got to use, again, I'm an economics guy, so my lens is economics. I see everything through the lens of economics. If you fix this economically, you then are just left with little things you have to fix politically.
I absolutely agree. You look at a poor white person and a poor Black person, and the poor white person says, at least I'm not Black, right?
Yeah.
And they know that they have very similar issues. They're both in similar government-based programs. They need the hand of government to help lift them out of certain circumstances. And so I absolutely agree that Black Lives Matter can't can't be separate from the financial
Right.
institution in which we are creating for our country moving forward. How do we address that part of it? Because eventually everyone's going to see this light, is saying we don't have the financial institutions that are creating fair practices for all
Right.
people of color, especially Black people. And so whereas initially we are taking a huge effort in kind of educating ourselves with, the historical context of, what Black people have had to go through in this country, tomorrow what it's going to be is,
Yep.
why aren't banks giving Black people a fair shot? Why are we constantly undervaluing and then gentrifying these communities
Yep.
in order to create value and then take that value away from the hands of the people who were living there in the first place?
And that's you see that you've hit on something that's interesting, because most liberal people think gentrification is great. Look how we've improved this neighborhood. I spent half my time in Philadelphia, and the big worry there is that people are actually able to live in that city until somebody buys up the block and makes it fancy, and it becomes like Williamsburg in Brooklyn or something like that. So we do have to think about that. I'm sort of sorry that the Democratic primary is over. Joe Biden's now the presumptive nominee, because while it was running, Democrats had heard the message loud and clear from the last election that Black people were tired of being taken for granted by them. So they came up with very specific programs. Kamala Harris and Cory Booker had particularly good ones, but so did Elizabeth Warren, so did other candidates, in which they were addressing the economic, educational and economic issues that face African Americans with very specific proposals, very detailed proposals. They all named them something. Bloomberg called it the Greenwood proposal, and Pete Buttigieg called his, can't remember what it was called, but they all had names and they were all specific and they had historical context, and they addressed the issues in which African American kids were going to get access to college, and then they wouldn't be burdened with remarkable debt, and they were going to deal with access to housing and finance. So we opened up a discussion about that, and there was actually a discussion about reparations, which some people object to because they're saying, I didn't hold slaves, why have I got to pay any money? But that's simplistic. It's not about giving Black people a check. It's about creating opportunities and opportunity zones and ways that they can create small businesses. That's all people want. They want a fair shake, right? Everybody likes the concept of meritocracy. They just want to be able to be at the starting line with everybody else. I think African Americans can say, I can run a business as well as anybody else can. Can I get the capital to raise it? Can I get the circumstances around me? Can I get a circumstance where people who live in the area that I would provide the service to can afford to buy my service? So there was a really, really sophisticated conversation underway with the Democratic candidates. My hope now is that continues, and that in the course of the election, African Americans, who I think are going to be very heavily motivated to vote in November, will press Joe Biden and their local candidates and their state representatives and their governors and their Senate candidates to say, what actually are you going to do? Not because it'll get done, but because it'll demonstrate whether the politicians have read their history and figured out what the solution looks like. There are many solutions. Those Democratic presidential candidates had lots of solutions across the board. Some of them are really good, and an amalgam of them might work. But the issue now is we have to do them. We have to stop talking about it. And African Americans are tired of being taken advantage of and expected to come out and vote for Democratic candidates when things don't change. Now, Donald Trump is making a push for African American candidates. He's got Blacks for Trump or something it's called. It's a very small organization. They meet in a local phone booth. But I don't think African Americans are, generally speaking, going to take that seriously. But for Democrats, there's real pressure to deliver, to say, if we elect you, you're going to fix this, right?
Absolutely. And Ali, you look at how we are becoming we're almost embarrassed with the lack of education that we've had about the country.
Yeah.
And I think the next phase of this is going to be a second round of lack of education that we have from a financial standpoint. So let us talk about the financial structures that we need to kind of proactively understand. Let's go into, the crux of capitalism and how it's based in racism. Racism and capitalism went hand in hand. And then you look at how economic structures that are based in maximizing profitability disproportionately are taking advantage of human capital. And maybe that'll, transition into robotics and things of that sort. But, what the slaves were, 400 years ago, today would be things like China and
totally right.
And so how do we look at
when slavery, everybody always talks about how quickly America overtook Great Britain, its parent, in economic growth after independence. Well, that's because America had free labor, right? So America squeezed free labor as long as it could until 1865, and then we ran out of free labor. Right. So we figured out this way to chase labor around the world at the lowest possible cost. First of all, we did it in America, right? We went from free labor, as I described, into sharecropping, which was also free labor for all intents and purposes. And to some degree, we saw some movements in the North with factories and with unions that started to do that. But as soon as wage rates started to go up in America, all we did is try to find places where there weren't good wage rates. And we still do that. We like our cheap goods. So we buy things in China, in Bangladesh, in Vietnam, in the Philippines, because we are chasing that. That is a remnant of the idea that I guess we can't get people to work for absolute free anymore. So we're going to get them to work for as little free or as little money as possible. That is a fundamental, we need a shift in how we think about labor and output. Right? If you start to consider your employees as constituents, if you think of, look at the things we've left out. We've left out employees as constituents. We've left out the earth. If you start to think of the fact that your job is to be a custodian of the earth, your employees are one part of your business, so are your clients, so are your shareholders, but they're all parts of it. We've ignored that. And we need to rethink that. We need to think of a human not as the greatest output that I can squeeze out of you in a day, but for other value. And some of the universal basic income conversations that are going on are not crazy, because they're saying that you may have greater value than the unit output that you can have as an engineer or an accountant. Because if we were measuring it that way, then we should all just be engineers and accountants, because that's the greatest output per unit that we can provide. But what if you're an artist? What if you're a poet? What if you're a hairdresser? What if you're a shopkeeper? There are ways of saying your value to society is greater than the profit you generate for me. And by the way, you want to see an example of this? Ask any woman who had to stay home to raise her kids. We don't pay for that. The society does not believe that is of value. So a woman who works to take care of her children, nowadays some men do it, but mostly women do it, does not get valued the same as the man who goes out to work, but she still takes care of the kids and takes care of the house and sometimes holds another job. So that's a perfect example. We haven't figured that out yet. So how are we going to figure out the value of humanity? Now, if we do that, it changes the whole game. It changes the basis on which you get mortgages. It changes the basis on which you get business loans. And so we're starting to see remnants of it. In the pandemic, what you've seen is unemployment now is extended to people who are gig workers and contract workers. So we're starting to move our heads into a place that says, other people have value. Even though an unemployment insurance deduction doesn't come off your paycheck because you're a gig worker, you're still part of our society. We need a sea change in how we think of people and their value. And then you start valuing people in a different way than their hourly output in terms of dollar value. But that is entrenched. You are absolutely right. People think it's a radical thing to say, but our reason for keeping wages low is rooted in slavery, and it is a concept we exported to the entire world.
Right. And tweets don't help. Right? When we have this very short attention span, we don't like to get into the details of financial models. It creates such a huge challenge because nobody's willing to have the conversation of, let's look at the strengths, the true strengths of capitalism. Let's take that, extrapolate what the true strengths of socialism are, and then tie that into what worked in communism. There are fine lines, and people have such divisions around these financial concepts, these economic models. How do we rethink what the future looks like of valuating human effort, right? And look at the value of humanity, the work that we're doing, and then rebalancing it with making the world a better place. Everybody is born, comes into this world, says, hey, number one philosophy, I want to make this world a better place. Well, you're ruining the environment. You're creating social injustice. You're gentrifying Black people. How are we looking at these?
The measure is, did you end up with more money than you started? Did you create wealth? And that's the problem, right? The beauty of capitalism, the thing that I never want to lose in capitalism is the incentive to do better. The incentive to say, if I create something neat, people will buy it and maybe I'll become rich. And that's a good reward. If you become rich for creating something, that's amazing. Good. That's what I don't want to take away. That's what communism couldn't offer. But why do we have to sort of make this into such a blood sport, right? Why can't we say most people are not going to invent the windshield washer? They're not going to invent Twitter. They're not going to invent Facebook. For most people, how do we value their output? How do we value that? Because if you're a good parent, there's got to be societal value to that, right? If you're a parent to help your kid get through school, there's got to be value in that. If you're fighting for social justice, there's got to be value in that. But we only value one thing in society, and that is output, generally speaking, for corporations. The lucky ones of us can work for ourselves, so that value comes for ourselves. But what we've learned in this pandemic is that it's those places that are getting shut down, the places that work for themselves. They can't keep afloat. The average business, never mind black businesses, the average business doesn't have 3 months of cash flow to stay afloat. Think about a restaurant. Think about a gas station. They don't have that. It's not how the world works. In the last recession, 40% of black-owned businesses were destroyed. They just went out of business. We got the same thing going on here, right? So we have to have structures that say, but we don't, because when you go to the bank for a loan, it is against your output. If you go in for a personal loan or mortgage, it's against your output. If you go for a mortgage, it's also about the value of your property, which, again, if you're black or you live in a bad area, that property is not valuable for the bank. If you go for a business loan, it's the same thing. So we have to start to think about this. And again, these inequalities have existed. When you look at women who try and get their businesses funded, they work 3 times as hard and they're funded at, I don't know, 1/10 the rate or something like that. So we just have to we need to think about reevaluating what we believe is valuable in society, what we will finance and how we will think about it. Capitalism's broken. But recently my plumbing was broken in Philadelphia. I didn't disavow plumbing. I brought a plumber over and said, "Can you please fix it? It's a distribution issue. I need my water. I get that it's coming into the house. It's not coming out of my taps. I need you to fix it." He fixed it. That's how we need to look at capitalism. We have to admit that it's broken, just like we talked about with societal injustice. It's broken. Capitalism is broken at the moment. Too few people with too much wealth. That's not why we wanted that system to work. If it doesn't work the way it was supposed to, people will start to disavow it. And that's what you're starting to see. So those of us who are capitalists and those of us who like capitalism need to take it upon ourselves to say, the thing's broken, let's fix it, because people are going to come up with something we don't like if they do. But if you want to fix capitalism, doesn't make you a communist. If you want to fix capitalism, doesn't make you a socialist. It makes you like me with my plumbing, a guy who wants the plumbing to work. So let's fix it.
Absolutely. And you look at this idea around, standard quality of life, standard of living, right? If you get to 80, that's where we need to get everybody to.
Correct.
Get everybody to the age of 80, because after 80, all of your output, you've lived a great life, you're healthy, things of that sort. And, once you get to a certain level of financial stability, you've made it. Let's get everybody to that point, because any more than that dollar amount is not really going to add to your personal quality of life. And so I think these are the type of measures that we need to start looking at and dissecting when we reform what our economics are going to look like in the future.
So that's why universal basic income is catching on with some people, because it's basically saying everybody has basic needs. And if you're at the lower end of the income scale, you spend such a great proportion of your money on basic needs that you don't have anything left over. In America, we have this added problem where if you lose your job, you also lose your health care, right? That doesn't typically happen in Western nations. So if you lose your job in Canada or in Norway or in the UK, it's bad because you'd like to have a job, but you then don't have to worry about the fact that either you might be ill or you might get ill. So there are starting points where we can start to sort of solidify the social safety net and say, let's get everybody into a place where they are not fighting to exist every day, that they can actually free their mind to become more creative. Because if your basic needs are taken care of, you then actually might become a more creative being. Your output might improve just by virtue of the fact that you're free to think about the things that you actually want to do or could be doing. But most Americans are not free for that right now. Most small business owners are not free to reinvent their business. They couldn't tell you if their sign in the front needs to be changed because they're too damn busy working to make ends meet or to make payroll. And that's what we need.
Black Lives Matter works. This is the argument of Black Lives Matter.
Yes.
We need to have a certain standard of living for everyone across the board. We need to fight for that in our democracy so that we can all rise together and hit a certain level so that everyone can be happy.
Then after that, you can do what you want. If you want to work 3 jobs because you want to earn 3 times the money, cool. That's your You should do it for freedom. You should do it because you want to, because you're tireless and you want to work all the time. But you shouldn't have to work 3 jobs to meet the poverty line. 140 people in America live in relative poverty. 40, 50 million people are food insecure, which means they don't know where their next meal is coming from. They maybe rely on a food bank. That was before the pandemic, by the way. So that number has probably increased. That in the richest country of the world doesn't make any sense, right? Why are we food insecure? Let's deal with that. Let's get people out of the worst situations. And then there's this margin of whether, okay, we're all at this level. I want to be here. I think I'm smarter. I think I'm more productive, whatever. But that's extra work as opposed to all the hard work to just keep your head above water, which is what many millions of Americans experience right now.
And I think it's this idea that we don't have enough all the time, right? So you look at, let's say, you model one person per billion people in the world. And I went through this study, and they said, where do you think you are amongst these 7 people? On the right-hand side, being the richest, the left being the poorest. I said, well, I might be maybe like number 3. And Ali, you would be so proud of me of how financially responsible I've been, how like I have saved for future generations. I'm in absolutely no debt, and I'm in surplus, and I'm well invested. And I think I'm number 3, right? I am like at the shoulder of the very first guy, right? It's this idea that we don't have enough, and we need to constantly keep working to fight for what might be ours. You know, the measures were looking at 7 billion people across the world, looking at where they sleep, how they store their salt, their plumbing, things of that sort. And you look at America and the standard of living in America, it is at the top. It is at the first guy, on the very right.
Yeah. So here's the trick. You know, when we do these measures of how our schools perform, right? Our high schools, they do math, they do other stuff, and we're 12 and 17 or something like that. The truth is, in America, you have some of the best schools in the world and some of the worst, right? We have, at the bottom end of our public education, we can be compared to developing nations. That's the problem. So your point was we should get everybody to live to 80. We should get everybody to have a similar public education. Right? Why is it that if you're black or brown and you live in certain zip codes, you just will get a substandard public education, which will lead you to a substandard university education if you are to get one at all? Why do we need to do that? That's an easy fix. And by the way, we have studied this for decades. There's no more learning to be had. There's no more learning to be had on fixing the environment. There's no more learning to be had in fixing public education. There's no more learning to be had in equitable capital distribution to people. There's nothing left to study. It just takes will, but will is led by acknowledgement. And I think your whole point in this discussion is if those of us who have do not acknowledge that there are people who don't have and that we are benefiting from it, we're not going to fix it. But there's no studying to be had. We can fix this thing overnight. We can fix this thing in the first 100 days of a presidency. We can fix public education. We can fix inequity. We can fix policing. In fact, there's a movement out there called 8 Can't Wait, about 8 things that police can do to reduce police violence. 6 of the 8 are literally things you could do overnight. 2 of them will require some thinking and some retraining and, expense and all that. But most of our problems are easy. We are not short. Remember, we are not short of food. We're not short of energy. We're not short of all the important things in life. The world's not overpopulated. Those things are not there. It is an application of things in a way that is equitable that should not make us sound like communists. Why can't capitalists want things that are equitable, a fair society? I get it. Everybody's not going to be at exactly the same level. That's cool. We're not looking for everybody to be at the same level. We're looking for everybody to be above the same minimum level. Then after that, do what you want.
Yeah, and there's this amazing author. Her name is Adrienne Marie Brown. I don't know if you know her or not, but she writes about this, and it's not about being utopian or dystopian. It's
Correct.
about creating this bare minimum, this threshold that everybody needs to get above in order to maintain civil society. That's really what it's about. When everyone has their minimum needs met, and as you said, you could do extra credit, you could take that 3rd job if you want to do way more, then crime rates go down. Police brutality goes down. It seems like today, the way that police are fixing police brutality is by more police brutality. Right. It's like, let's get these people to shut up. And it's being supported by the top down, by the president himself. And we now have to look at this like, hey, is this this type of society that we actually want to live in?
Yeah, and I think that question is being answered. That's the good part. I think what Americans are saying is, no, it's not. No, it's not their problem. It's actually meaning African Americans. This actually is a real problem. And at these protests, there was a Senator Tina Smith was on with my colleague Joy Reid the other day, and she was saying, let's not lose focus on George Floyd. When all of this mayhem goes on, we're not honoring George Floyd. That's a simplistic way of looking at things.
Right.
George Floyd is this last week's incarnation of this problem.
Yes.
George Floyd, I think, be fine with the idea that we are trying to address the systemic problems that leads to his death and leads to the death of Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and Eric Garner and Michael Brown and Trayvon Martin. There's a problem that's not actually specific to any one of these people. It's a societal problem. And I think that we are starting to understand that how big it is, and that it is not actually just about police, and that it is all our problem to solve, and that people's minimum needs are not being met by society. And frankly, as an economics guy, I think the economics are better in giving everybody their minimum needs. It would break society less. I think we would get a better return on our investment than the way we're doing it, because this social unrest and is not good for anybody's economy. It's not good for our well-being. It's not good for our souls. It's not good for advancement. It's not good for the reputation of America to be on the lead of everybody else's news story because reporters are getting attacked and protesters are getting attacked. We need to fix this because of who we are. I am hopeful, from what I've seen in the last couple of weeks, that Americans of all stripes are recognizing this.
I want to shift gears a little bit, and I want to start talking about the other side. And when we look at the algorithm that I'd like to create, we can kind of discern it a little bit, is the First Amendment is freedom of speech. Now, if freedom of speech gets dissembled for whatever reason, we kind of move to the Second Amendment, right? Which is the right to bear arms. And we say, okay, well, if it's not going our way, let's say, for example, hey, freedom of speech is actually getting out of the control of the people that need the control over freedom of speech. Let's start exercising the Second Amendment now. This is the dog whistle that I'm seeing when I'm looking back at 2016 to today. When we look at what fake news really is, and and I actually learned this watching so many of your shows and saying, hey, in your TED Talk recently, which was, hey, we cannot discount good journalism and we have to look at where our sources are coming from and do a little bit of cross-reference. But when everything becomes fake news, what happens is it becomes a seismic shift in what reality really is and what freedom of speech looks like moving forward. Right. And if we say, listen, there's too much protest to this society that I don't want to be a part of. There's 400 million guns and 320 million people, and we know where the guns are. And so, where do we look at how to process, hey, First Amendment is going away because I think personally is a dog whistle from the top down to say, hey, there's a movement coming here. Let's start looking at this Second Amendment a little bit. Let's start exercising.
Yeah, and that's been a dog whistle that Trump has used from the beginning, right? He used this reference before the 2016 election to, making sure you've got your Second Amendment in case something happens and Hillary Clinton going to take it away and all that kind of stuff. I think that it's weird. What's going on right now is strange because they are tied together. And I'm not quite sure why some Americans have decided that that there's some speech that's too much for them, that they can't handle these protests. I do worry about where this is going, but ultimately this is still a country in which the political power lies with people and voters. And I'm constantly surprised when I see polling that shows the president performing as strongly as he is, but it does seem to be shifting at this point. And I think we have to, just like most Americans do not really fully understand the First Amendment because you have to understand the historical context in which it was set. And a lot of other Western democracies don't have something as strong as the First Amendment. There is something really, really important about it. There's something really, really important, particularly about press freedoms, because our job is to hold authority to account. Authority naturally does not wish to be held to account. That's fine. But we are to do that. And you can't hold power to account if you can't bear witness. Right? As journalists, we have to bear witness. What I was doing in the streets of Minneapolis and Chicago and New York was bearing witness. My team and I showing you what was going on, so that when authorities tell you we didn't tear gas them and we didn't throw rubber bullets, we didn't do that stuff, we were able to tell you, actually, yeah, you did. And now it's for society to determine whether that was appropriate or not. But we have this First Amendment. We are in a place that feels authoritarian to me right now. We're in a place that if I were somewhere else and reporting on it, I'd be very puzzled. I'd be, we'd know that all of America would be on the same side of the people fighting an authoritarian regime that uses bullets on them and tear gas and has authorities go out without badges and without insignia into unprovoked crowds. I have a flak jacket, a bulletproof vest that I wear under my shirt. Never worn it in America before. I have a gas mask sitting here on my kitchen table that I travel with. I've got helmets, never used them in America. I think this should be very, 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 very alarming to Americans. They need to sit there and say, hold on a second. If everybody who doesn't like the administration is the enemy, feels a little bit like China, feels a little bit like Russia, feels a little bit like Iran, feels a little bit like these other places that we are very quick to criticize, and we should be. Feels like Brazil, feels like the Philippines. It's one thing in the Philippines, the guy didn't like drug dealers, so he was summarily executing them. And a lot of people say, I don't like drug dealers either. But we don't do things without the rule of law. We don't do things without due process. So we need to think about that very well. The Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, which, again, I think people should study and understand why it exists, is not the solution to the First Amendment being misrepresented. And when it comes to the Second Amendment, here's the weird part. The majority of Americans, 90% plus, believe in improvements to the way we handle gun safety and gun violence in this country. There's very little. I don't think 90% plus Americans can agree on what the sky looks like outside on a sunny day. So this is weird, right? This takes leadership. We're going to have leadership that says, let's figure this out. There are gun policies that can be had that are safe, and we're not coming to take your guns, but they are safe, and there are First Amendment protections that we have to have, and both can coexist. But we've gotten into this weird conversation today that I don't even understand why it's happening.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit, because I think there's a lot of concern around the Boogaloo movement, the second coming of the Civil War, and how it relates to all the dog whistling that's been accumulated over the last 3 years, coming on to 4 years now. So, to talk to us a little bit about that, and what you're seeing from a journalistic standpoint.
Yeah, so first of all, there's way more energy on the argument that the administration's been using during these last protests is that there's an Antifa element to it, and they've rented buses. Antifa doesn't have a bank account; they can't rent a bus. It's not a thing, really. The only arrests that have been made have been on the side of right-wing extremists, and that the seeds have been planted for that for a while, right? There's been these preppers and folks who do that. I don't want to be mean and throw all preppers into. Some preppers just want to have beans and water in case things go wrong. But there's been this weird movement about guns and militias and anti-government. We've seen that over the last few decades, combined with this alt-right movement, which has been a remarkable social media-based aggregation of people who have independent but unrelated complaints. So some of them are people who have complaints about Asians getting into university at a rate faster than them. Some of them didn't get a job and they think it's because a woman got it. Some of them don't like affirmative action. Some of them think gay people shouldn't have rights. Some of them think transgender people shouldn't have bathrooms. Someone figured out how to get them all together to be mad about the same stuff. And the cost of joining that club is you have to take on all the grievances. So what you saw in Charlottesville, young people, sometimes college educated, not wearing hoods, chanting racist strategies, but there was like, Jews will not replace us, and they were talking about blacks. It's like, were you born with all this hatred? I mean, how did that all come together? Someone's gotten smart and saying, you, young white man, are disadvantaged in society. Some of you are disadvantaged by blacks, some of you are disadvantaged by gays, some by women, some by Asians, some by gays. They created a zero-sum game out of it, right? That anything you lose, they get, or anything they get, you lost. It's been very effective. And it's dampened the discourse around some of these ideas, and it's created a movement that in some cases has become violent. In Charlottesville, it absolutely was violent. In many of the cases of mass shootings we've seen in America, there have been ties to these right-wing groups. In fact, right-wing extremism is a much greater threat to Americans than terrorism ever was, actually. Far more people are killed by right-wing extremism than by terrorism. And it's only this in the last year that the federal government and the administration has started to take that seriously. Antifa's never killed a human. Like, I don't even know what Antifa is. It's this weird anarchic kind of lawless thing, but they're not really a presence on these things. So I think we have to take very seriously these right-wing movements. And my friends who have worked in law enforcement and anti-terrorism are often very concerned that we don't take this seriously enough, because unlike 9/11 style terrorism, which you can see and you can feel and it's visceral, you can't see this other stuff as easily. You see a mass shooting, you see Charlottesville, but you don't see it as being part of your life or your existence. It still feels like them. It is actually much more serious than that. And I think it would behoove us to pay good attention to what's going on in the right wing.
Yeah, this is as if everyone else is playing chess and we're playing checkers,
Right.
or everyone is speaking in dolphin and we don't know how to discern these things until
Right.
it's, and we're looking back and we're saying, oh my goodness, like, I can't believe this was what was happening. This was underpinning these conversations the
Yes,
whole
right.
time. And this is
And we
what
often do find these things in hindsight, right? But the experts are telling us it's not hindsight. It's happening now. There are very few instances where we don't see that connection. Now, there are also connections, as we've seen, to Islamic extremism. They attract, by the way, similar people, right? It's the same mindset. Young men who are idle are the bane of the world's existence. It just depends where you are and the color of your skin to determine where you're joined. It's the same thing with gangs. It's the same thing with skinhead movements. It's all the same thing. But ultimately, this administration would like to paint a picture of either Islamic extremism or Antifa, weird left-wing extremism. Fine, all extremism is bad. I'll sign on to that bus anytime. But the real threat that has actually taken lives in America is right-wing extremism.
Yeah, absolutely. And you look at the common thread. The common thread is the disenfranchisement of people, whether it's one type, one color,
Yes.
or whatever. And that's what leads all of this Black Lives Matter movement together, is to say, let's not disenfranchise anyone. Let's give
Yes.
everybody a certain standard of living so that they matter. Let's give them, a place in society where they don't need to turn to violence, where they don't need to turn to hate, where they can live freely. And I
Yeah.
think there's
Because when you talk to experts who have worked with extremists, and I mean real extremists, people who do violent things, um, there's always a sense of validation that they get from joining those groups, right? So the answer is there was an absence of validation. Now, some of it we can't fix, maybe, I don't know,
right.
but it's validation, and validation comes from work, value, experience, inclusion in society, and that's what we find. Like, in the end, you do have to stop Antifa from, or whoever, from recruiting, and Boogaloo, and the alt-right, and the skinheads, and Al-Qaeda, and ISIS. And it's always the same recipe to stop them from recruiting, right? Figure out the people who are likely to be their targets by virtue of the fact that they're idle and lacking in validation. Give them validation somewhere else. And guess what? Suddenly they're not looking to be terrorists. Suddenly they're not looking to be violent. I'm not in any way justifying any of these people's choices to do violent things. It's all abhorrent. But we can try and intercept this at the front end. But again, you can't intercept it if you don't admit that it's actually a thing.
Wow. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think when we look at where our faith kind of brings all of this back together, actually, before we get to that point, I want to talk a little bit about the difference between how, these right-wing extremist parties organize and then the organization of the Black Lives Movement. From my understanding, it's a hashtag. It is something that's completely decentralized. It's not something that can be broken down or taken away overnight, like the shooting of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. or Malcolm X, where you have somebody that's kind of the head of the movement, but it's being spread across all of, and it's a great grassroots movement. How do you see this kind of taking and hitting this threshold where we have true impact, aside from the dollars that we spend and the places that we vote?
Yeah, unfortunately, the sad part about Black Lives Matter is that it heats up when things like this happen. And what you've had is two things happen with the killing of George Floyd. The first one is that we all watched a man narrate his death, right, on video. And it kind of seemed obvious to you that at least 4 police officers should have been arrested immediately. And by the way, I think people are entitled to a fair trial. So I don't know that 4 police officers being arrested means 4 police officers get convicted, but it struck people as strange that even that wasn't happening. So that was odd. In the case of Eric Garner, it took 5 years to fire the police officer. So on one hand, there was that was visceral. And then there was the fact that this came at the end of a series of things that we'd been watching. The killing of Breonna Taylor in Louisville, who was doing Absolutely nothing. They busted into her house and got into a gunfight with her boyfriend who had a licensed firearm, and she got killed. The killing of Ahmaud Arbery, which feels very much like a lynching. A bunch of guys just took him down and killed him. So there was this crescendo of stuff that ended up with George Floyd, and I think that was part of it. But what do you do in the in-between times? What do you do? So some people will tell you there are no in-between times. There's always somebody who's dying at the hands of police. It just doesn't always get that heated. But what do you do? And I think that's part of it, that the movements have to have goals. And that's why there is the 8-cat wait, and there are various goals that say, here's what we have to do to reduce police violence. If a movement is just grievance, it's interesting, but a lot of these right-wing movements are just grievance, right? There are people who get up there and they tell them that this is what you need to do. You need to attack people. You need to do that kind of stuff. And it tends to not be organized, which is why it's so hard to bring charges against right-wing extremists in this country, because it's a little bit loosey-goosey. And by the way, for ISIS and Al-Qaeda, it's the same thing. They give these generalized instructions about you should target authority, and sometimes they publish lists of people who you should target and places you can target. So it becomes hard to understand. 9/11 was easy to understand because there were plans and they were carried out and it was highly specific. So, I think that we have to understand that the counter movements can be very dangerous, but they're hard to pin down. On the other hand, Black Lives Matter is a civil rights movement. It's a justice movement. It's not substantially different than the civil rights movement we saw with Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. That's just a movement that says, it's really not complicated. That's the beauty of Black Lives Matter. That's all it says. Black Lives Matter. Do you want to be on the wrong side of that one? I have people on my Twitter who are completely on the wrong side of it. And I don't really understand. It's like, so Black lives don't matter? I don't understand what you're getting at here. But people have come to see the world in zero-sum terms. If Black lives matter, that must mean mine doesn't. Or that must mean mine matters less. It's just a weird way of looking at the world, but we're facing it.
Yeah, and I think the conversation needs to be around, if your democracy matters, then
Correct.
Black lives matter.
Correct. That's right. Black lives matter to democracy.
The democracy.
But by the way, so do others. If you're under the list of democracy, as you've said, we all just need a minimum level of sustenance and fairness and social justice and economic prosperity. And then everybody's lives matter. That's true. I totally get that point. Black Lives Matter is not meant to negate anybody else's lives mattering. And that's what we have to get through our thick skulls, that this is not an exclusive movement. This is not, and by the way, Black Lives Matter doesn't not want support from other people. They're thrilled that young white people are out there supporting their movement, in some cases outnumbering them. I've been talking to Black activists for the last week and a half. None of them have said, get out of our movement, right? They just want to, it's just asking for a basic acknowledgement. Is it controversial if I have a hashtag that says that I'm bald? No, it's what it is. Just say it with me. That's what it is. If you're ignoring that, you're just ignoring a reality. So if you don't say Black Lives Matter, that means you don't believe that Black Lives Matter. It's not enough to just be in a middle space here, particularly in this world of injustice and confusion and fake news and nonsense that goes around. It's not enough to just be okay with that. You actually have to say, that's not the future I want for myself or my kids in this country.
Yeah, it's a practice of democracy. If Black Lives does not pass, if it's not working and it fails, then democracy has failed in and of itself. Right. And I think that's what we need to start understanding, absorbing, and moving forward with. When we look at, other places of color, right? We look at other communities that are coming around this Black Lives Matter movement. The reason why they're not upset that we're a part of it is because racism is not their problem. Racism is our problem. We are the ones who created racism. We're the ones who perpetuate racism. And we have to unpack racism as within ourselves individually. We have to get educated, educate our communities, and look into these inherent biases that we have that say, why am I treating this person this way? Why am I judging this person this way?
Well, why are they being treated? And I think it's important to understand that even if you didn't do it, it's still incumbent upon you.
Why am I allowing people to be treated this way?
Correct. Right. If they're getting it, and I think it's an important point, because victims of racism are trying to tell us, it's not my fault. I'm not making this problem. How can it be for me to solve it? And a lot of white people in positions of power in the last week and a half, including police chiefs and politicians, have said, this is ours to solve, right? White supremacy is a white problem to solve. Racism is it's not on blacks to solve this. It's not on Black Lives Matter to solve this problem. It's for you to get it and say, how do I solve it? It's all of our problem.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. You know, when we look at how we're kind of bringing faith together, communities together, and we say, man, I was a very faithful, evangelist. I was a very faithful Christian. I was a very faithful Muslim or a Hindu or Jewish person. And we say, man, like, how do we reconcile what our communities were doing, our interpretation of creation and God and all of these things? And how do we start saying, man, our institutions didn't do the best job in helping us understand that all men are created equal? And we're looking back at our institutions and saying, man, like, perhaps, this wasn't the right way forward, right?
But the beauty of movements like this is it doesn't matter what came before, right? This is the beauty of this moment is that if you weren't an evangelist for racial equality and things like that, it's okay. You can become one now. You can sign up today for the first time and no one will hold it against you, right? This is the moment to say, I did not know what happens out there. There are a lot of people out there saying, I didn't know, I used to talk about this on the news where people would tell me young African-American men are shot unarmed. And people, good thinking people would tell me that wouldn't be the case. They wouldn't actually just shoot somebody who wasn't armed, who wasn't threatening them. And then video came out. And then there was cell phone video. And then you started to say, oh my gosh, this actually happens. Maybe they weren't lying about it. And then you see video after video after video after video. At this point, it's okay to say, I didn't really know, right? Even in South Africa during apartheid, there were a lot of people, the press was censored. There were actually people who said they didn't know how bad it was. Okay, but now you know. Now there's no excuse. So it's okay. Don't beat yourself for what you didn't do or what your institutions didn't do or what your faith community didn't do or your church didn't do or your political party didn't do. Everybody's got blemishes. But this is our moment to change. And by the way, this is how we saw it with the climate movement, right? We saw people whose kids understood climate change, but they didn't. And they'd take them to an Earth Day march or something. And then they'd come around and say, wow, my kids showed me about this and I've learned about it. It's the same thing with gay rights. There are all sorts of people who got all sorts of positions on it until the kid's gay. Then they're like, you know what? I get this now. That's okay. Doesn't matter how you get there, but get there.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, you're a beacon of light in all too dim of a world. All the work that you do, everything that you do for our community, for the greater community of journalism and professionally, you just show up so well for all of us. And I can't thank you enough for giving us your time today.
Well, thank you for your time. This is a good, hearty discussion, and it's really kind of interesting in times like this to be able to have a good, long-form discussion too. It helps me process it too, so I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I hope this is one of many conversations that you and I have together. I think everyone is also thinking about, how you perceive things, right? I mean, you have so much information that's coming at you from so many different angles. I mean, you were just with Bill Gates a few weeks ago, and you have to educate yourself on, how pandemics work, how vaccines work. BLM came literally right after that. The reason why our original interview got postponed is because I got an email from your assistant saying, hey, Ali's off to, Minnesota, like now. and it's like, oh man, like I have no idea how you're processing all this information in so many different ways, and you're doing such an incredible job. But I think that's going to be the next show. If you would love, if I would love to have
I will definitely join you again. I would love to do that.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. But yeah, I think everything that you do is just a blessing, and I can't thank you enough.
My pleasure.
All right, we'll talk soon.
Okay.
Thanks.